Hey up! It struck me in last week's video, the cleaning video, that I'd commented about what an outstanding riding season this had been because of the weather. But for me, really, it's been a bit of a washout. As you know, I injured my foot in the sort of early months of this year, which has made riding incredibly uncomfortable for me. And the advice that I was given is, if it's causing discomfort, don't ride. So I've only done a few 100 miles this year. Life is short, and I have to admit it's left me feeling a bit cheated. But on the upside, I have seen a significant improvement in my foot just over the last couple of weeks, so fingers crossed. As a lot of you will be aware, the Classic 500 was a lifelong bucket list bike for me, and this particular bike was one of the last available in the UK. In fact, I think in this colour, the graphite grey, it was the last bike in the United Kingdom, and I'm so glad that I got it. We've formed a bond, me and this bike, that I affectionately call the Mule, and it's a bond that I believe will never be broken. I'll own this bike until the day I die. I remember reading an article back in 2011, whenever it was, not long after this new unit construction had hit the market with the then new version of the Classic and Bullet models, and I read that Royal Enfield had deliberately tried to keep the feel of the bike slightly agricultural. At that time, Royal Enfield didn't have the international respect that it has now, and their biggest market was the domestic market in India. The Bullet had had a cult following for decades, and Royal Enfield were worried that if they sanitised the bike too much and didn't maintain some of that pre-unit character, they would alienate the main customer base in India, and to some extent that still happened. But on the whole, it was a success. A success which opened up the market for Royal Enfield internationally, albeit on a small scale compared to, their stature, if you like, today. The introduction of the new Interceptor 650 and the Continental GT 650, 3 or 4 years ago, changed everyone's perception of Royal Enfield. Honest, modern, smooth, practical motorcycles at a reasonable price. So when it came to the new J Platform 350cc single, Royal Enfield were finally in a position to sort of shake off those shackles that the old classics had sort of lumbered them with and build a proper, modern, smooth iteration of that iconic, classically styled motorcycle, the new 350 Classic. Now, there have been literally dozens and dozens of reviews on this bike, and possibly hundreds of reviews done on the old classics. And in most cases, yes, those reviews have pointed out the differences between the two bikes. But I don't think the little tweaks that make the 350 so much more rideable and convenient have ever really been discussed, or at least not in any great detail. Yes, the new 350 handles better, it's got a much better chassis. Yes, the engine is much smoother and refined, but there is a little bit more to it than that. There are some sort of more subtle nuances that have been built into this bike which are not really obvious until you ride both bikes together long term, as I have. Little things that over time you notice and realise actually they make a huge difference to the pleasure of riding. Now, I've made a list of just 5 things, but actually the list does extend beyond 5. I'm just trying to keep it more compact for the sake of this video. Although really this video is 6 differences that make an enormous difference to your riding pleasure, although one I'm just going to put down as a honourable mention. These two bikes in isolation look very much the same. It's only when you put them side by side that you actually realise the two very different bikes. Pretty much everything, and I mean everything, is a completely new design on the new 350. But there are some improvements that Royal Enfield have made that are not immediately noticeable. And a lot of them, I have to say, are not mentioned in reviews. In fact, I don't think I mentioned them in my reviews, not to any great extent anyway. Starting off with the engine startup fast idle, or I suppose you could call it a choke of sorts. Now, the old motor was still a modern fuel-injected motor, and as such, I've got no idea why there was a need to incorporate what amounts to a choke lever that could easily have been overcome with the software in the ECU. And to be honest, even on a cold day, it's not really required. All it does really is raise the idle speed on cold startup. Now, I suspect that Royal Enfield incorporated this for the reasons I explained earlier on. They didn't want to alienate their old domestic customers. It was there to, if you like, imitate the old pre-unit engines. A nice vintage touch that, actually, I quite enjoyed when I first got the bike, but not really necessary. Now, the problem is, it slows down engine warm-up. You have to hold that lever back to get the engine up to, a reasonable operating temperature, even though it's only a few seconds, and to get the engine oil circulating up to the top end where it's needed most. An added complication which, once the novelty's worn off, can be a little bit annoying. Royal Enfield clearly realised this, so with the new model, this has been deleted completely. Engine warm-up is taken care of via software in the ECU, which basically takes care of this manual operation automatically for you, just like on any other modern vehicle that's been built over the last 20 or 30 years. Clearly, Royal Enfield now feel confident enough to remove that additional manual operation, and the bike is much better and convenient for it. Now, the other improvement that they've made is the DRL, or daytime running lights. It's a legal requirement in most countries now for the headlamp to be on permanently. So as a result, almost all modern motorcycles, the headlamp is illuminated as soon as you switch the ignition on. The problem is, that headlamp bulb represents a significant draw on the battery before the engine started. In fact, most seasoned motorcyclists know that you should start the engine up almost as soon as you've switched the ignition on, to minimise unnecessary draw on the battery before the engine started. Even so, as the bike and so the battery get older, this does start to cause problems. And it can lead to premature failure of the battery in due course. Now, Royal Enfield are not the only ones to have the bike set up in this way. The old air-cooled Triumph Bonnevilles were the same, and eventually it necessitated Motorn Customs bringing out a harness which disabled the light until you actually switched it on yourself, because so many people were having issues with the battery as a result. Now, this doesn't only manifest as a problem on old bikes. A new bike that's ridden infrequently or only takes short trips can also encounter these issues, something which I think is still present with the new liquid cooled Bonnevilles. Now, this is what I like about Royal Enfield. They haven't just continued to do things the same way that they've always done and the same way that everyone else does it. So when you switch the ignition on the new 350, the headlamp doesn't come on automatically. In fact, it doesn't come on until the engine actually starts up and is running. Now, I never even noticed this until I was reviewing some footage that I'd shot for another video, because obviously you're always stood behind the bike when you switch the ignition on. But actually, for owners, this is a bit of a game changer, and it's going to save people money in the long run. Over the months and years, this is going to take a lot of strain off the motorcycle's battery. And I'm presuming that this facility is going to be present on the Hunter and the Meteor. This might seem like just a little thing that isn't really that noteworthy, but believe me, This is a big improvement. All it took was some rudimentary electronics or a change to the software. And I think it's a pretty clear demonstration that Royal Enfield cares about its customers. Right, next up, the foot pegs. Or more specifically, the rider's foot pegs. On the old classics, this was a big criticism in a lot of reviews that I've watched. The rider's foot pegs are rigid mounted to the motorcycle's frame. They don't flip up. Now, I've never actually heard of this happening, but of course the theory is that if you lean the bike over too far and these foot pegs catch the road, it's effectively going to act like a pole vault, which could result in the bike crashing. Now, to be honest, I think the dangers of this in reviews have been overplayed for the sake of a little bit of sensationalism, but it doesn't override the fact that it is a possibility that these pegs could cause an accident if they touch down, if you're, shall we say, cornering a little bit more enthusiastically than you should be. And as a result of that, I have on numerous occasions while negotiating a bend checked myself because of these foot pegs. It does put that nagging doubt in the back of your mind that spoils your enjoyment a little bit sometimes. Thankfully, with the new 350 Classic, Royal Enfield have sorted this out and they've now incorporated more conventional fold-up rider's foot pegs, complete with an angle lean indicator or hero blob. Obviously, these foot pegs touching down are not going to create the same issues that those rigid foot pegs will. And they will, with reasonable safety, offer you an indication that you're pushing the bike too far and give you the opportunity to get a grip of your ego. Now, I suppose number 4 is it, and probably the most obvious next one up is the instrument panel. On the older classics, information for the rider is sparse, with just a petrol light indicator to give you an idea whether you're about to run out of fuel or not. This usually starts to sort of come on and off intermittently, especially under braking or banking, not long after the tank itself is half empty. It's better than nothing, but yeah, it's not ideal. And I have to admit, it does sometimes cause some unscheduled fuel stops a little earlier than you need to. The old ammeter window, to my mind, could have been utilised with a conventional needle-type fuel gauge, but Royal Enfield obviously opted to use that for other things. Now, yes, I know I've complained about this LCD panel in previous sort of videos about this bike, but my complaints have been more about its execution than its existence, and I can't deny that having a proper fuel gauge is wonderful. Knowing exactly where you are with the amount of fuel that you have left is a great anxiety lifter. I'm not too bothered about the clock, but the 2 trip meters also come in quite handy for monitoring fuel usage and distances between services. Information that simply wasn't available on the old Classic, and I have to say its inclusion on this bike is very welcome. Right, so the last thing before we get on to that final honourable mention. The steering lock. Now, this is an absolute must for sort of casual security when you're out and about, or even when it's stored in your garage. And yes, it's a nice vintage or classic touch, but in the case of the old Classic, it was a separate lock underneath the headstock, just like on the older pre-2016 Triumph Bonnevilles and the current Bonneville Bobbers. Again, this is an additional operation that the rider has to go through before riding his bike or putting his bike away. I'm not complaining about it, it's not without its charms, but I have, over the 2 years that I've had this bike, had the odd senior moment with it. I've never forgotten to lock the bike up. The problem has been when it's been time to set off again. I've switched the ignition on, and then just as I'm about to put it into gear to set off, I realised that the lock is still engaged. I've maybe done it 3 or 4 times in 2 years. And that means that you've then got to take the ignition out of the ignition lock, unlock the bike and then start all over again. Also, there's times when I've put the bike away in the garage and I've got back into the house and I couldn't remember whether I'd engaged the lock or not. At least with a standard ignition lock setup on a standard bike, you know where you are. And there are numerous times before going to bed I've had to go back into the garage just to ensure, just to get rid of that nagging doubt that I had locked the bike up. An ignition operated steering lock is by far the most sensible and convenient solution, which is why most motorcycles in the world have had them fitted for the past 40 years that I can remember. It's far safer, and it does alleviate for the most part any doubt as to whether you've locked your bike up securely before leaving it or not. And let's face it, with this system there's no way you can accidentally ride up off with the lock still engaged. I don't miss the column lock on this bike. So finally, that honourable mention. Royal Enfield, on all the bikes that I'm aware of, usually a slightly narrower gauge tube in the construction of the handlebars, as opposed to the 1-inch tubes that most manufacturers use. This results in skinnier hand grip. Now, this is fine for riders with small to medium-sized hands, but I have big hands, and I did find these particularly uncomfortable when I first started riding the Royal Enfield. In fact, on the Interceptor 650, if you remember, I leather wrapped the hand grips just to increase the diameter a little bit to afford a little bit more comfort and security when riding the bike. Now, I know that this has provoked some complaints and debates on the various forums over the years with Royal Enfield riders who have found this to be an issue, and it seems to me that Royal Enfield have been watching and taking note, because on the new 350 they fitted them with barrel-shaped grips. At either end of each grip the diameter is the same as it was on the old Royal Enfield grips, but it swells in the middle, which makes it a sort of a barrel shape, just enough to make the hand grips comfortable for larger hands. Grips like this are usually an add-on option, you know, something that costs you more money, and it's nice to see that Royal Enfield have been thoughtful enough to incorporate these as standard on these bikes. I believe they're the same on the Meteor as well. It makes an enormous difference in both security of grip and comfort for riders like me. Hence the honourable mention. Thank you very much, Royal Enfield. So, in conclusion, in the greater scheme of things, these might not seem like, you know, big improvements for any bike. In fact, most owners probably just expect them to be there because they're used to having that sort of convenience. But that's not how it used to be with the old classics. So to me, these represent significant changes. The old classic was built the way it was built for a reason. It was because of its core audience. These improvements have come about not because Royal Enfield didn't know how to do it before, as a lot of people have suggested. It's because they were worried that doing it might affect sales in their domestic market. Because the Royal Enfield Classic has always been a very special motorcycle. Now, people are always asking me, you know, which one should I go for? I've got the choice of buying a new J-Platform 350 Classic, or there's a bike that I know of that's low mileage, Classic 500, really good condition, both a similar price. Which one should I get? Well, you know, I can't advise people which bikes to get. All I can do is arm you with as much information as possible through the various videos that I make. This being one of those videos. They are both fantastic bikes, but if you're looking for day-to-day comfort and ultimate convenience, I think the 350 is one that you perhaps should be looking at. The older 500 is more of an acquired taste, but if you have that taste, there is no substitute for it. It has a unique character that the new 350, I'll be honest, doesn't have. But if you're looking for the looks of the Classic without the eccentricities, then the 350 is probably the one to go for. Right, once again, thank you so much for watching this and my other videos, and in doing so helping to support this channel. I really do appreciate it. I would also appreciate it if you would consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel if you're not already a subscriber. It does help me out, and if you hit the notification bell and ensure that your notifications are enabled, you will be alerted whenever I upload a new video. I am of course going to be back on Friday, so until then, please ride safely, and I'll see you soon.